Ever get that feeling like someone's watching you, but you turn around and there's no one there?
Chills, right.
Makes you wonder, what if it's not some shadowy figure? What if it's someone you see every day? Someone who blends right in.
Someone who could live right next door.
Today, we're going deep on a chilling thought. Serial killers, and the fact that they could be anyone.
That's what makes them so fascinating, right? I mean, the FBI, they define a serial killer as someone who commits at least 3 murders, but with a crucial distinction, a cooling off period between each one.
Cooling off, period.
Yeah, so this isn't about some sudden burst of rage. This is calculated, planned, almost like a sinister hobby.
A hobby. Okay, now that's sending chills down my spine. It gives a whole new meaning to keeping up appearances. Okay, so let's break down this cooling off period. What makes it so different from, say, a crime of passion?
Okay, so think of it this way. Most murders, they're impulsive, driven by, immediate emotion.
In the heat of the moment kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. But a serial killer, they might go weeks, months, even years between murders, all while living what appears to be, a perfectly normal life.
It's like their humanity is almost fragmented. One part of them is methodical, almost robotic in planning these horrific acts, and the other part is out there buying groceries, holding down a job. That duality is just unnerving.
Precisely. And, for many, the act itself isn't just about the killing.
It's about more than that.
Oh, yeah, it's about fulfilling a deep psychological need: control, power, often fueled by dark fantasies they've crafted in their minds. It becomes almost ritualistic, a way to, dominate and control.
So the murder is more like a symptom, not the cause. It's this underlying need, this emptiness they're trying to fill that truly sets them apart, which makes you wonder, what creates that need in the first place? Is it something they're born with, or is it rooted in their past? I'm particularly interested in the role of childhood, because isn't that where our sense of empathy, our moral compass, starts to form?
You've hit on a crucial point. Well, it's important to remember that trauma doesn't equal destiny.
Right. Most people who experience trauma don't become serial killers.
Exactly. But there is a startling prevalence of severe childhood trauma in the histories of many serial killers. We're talking abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, experiences that leave deep scars.
Scars that shape how they view the world, how they connect with others, maybe even how their brains develop. Like, take Jeffrey Dahmer. We all know the horrific nature of his crimes, but what's truly disturbing is how detached he seemed from it all.
And Dahmer's case is particularly insightful because beyond the more commonly known details of his troubled upbringing, we find chilling specifics. For instance, as a child, he was fascinated by dissecting roadkill. Not out of cruelty, he claimed, but curiosity.
Okay.
Now, many kids might be momentarily curious, but Dahmer's interest was obsessive, almost as if he was trying to understand life by taking it apart piece by piece.
Whoa. Okay, that's a whole other level of unsettling. It's like his way of interacting with the world even back then was already skewed. But you made a crucial point earlier. Trauma itself doesn't create a killer. So what else is going on? Could there be something deeper, something encoded in their very biology that makes them susceptible?
It's almost like we're talking about a recipe for disaster, right? A traumatic childhood, this fractured sense of self. And then you add in this other ingredient, this biological wild card we call psychopathy.
The nature versus nurture debate taken to a terrifying extreme. So break down psychopathy for us. What are we really talking about here? Is it just a coldness?
Yeah.
A lack of empathy?
It's more nuanced than just, simple coldness. Think of it as a disconnect between knowing and feeling. Psychopaths, they understand intellectually that actions have consequences, that causing harm is wrong. But the emotional weight of those actions, the gut-wrenching empathy most of us would feel, it's just not there.
So they know it's wrong, but they don't feel it.
Exactly. In fact, many exhibit this chilling charisma, a superficial charm that draws people in, which makes them even more dangerous.
Like Ted Bundy, right. He was infamous for using his charm to lure victims into a false sense of security. But if this emotional disconnect is so central to psychopathy, can we actually see it in the brain? Is there a physical difference we can point to?
Here's where it gets really interesting. Studies using brain imaging, particularly focusing on the amygdala, that's the part of our brain responsible for processing fear and empathy, show a distinct difference in psychopaths.
So while most people would be horrified, maybe even physically sick at the thought of violence, someone with these differences might not even flinch. It's like their internal alarm system is broken.
Exactly. One study found that when shown images of violence, psychopaths showed significantly less activity in the amygdala compared to, a control group. Their brains just weren't processing the emotional content of the images in the same way. Yeah, it's as if their brains are wired differently, leading them to not just understand the world differently, but to feel it differently.
Which, when you think about it, is terrifying. But it also raises a question. If someone's brain is wired this way from the start, does that mean every psychopath is destined to become a serial killer? Are we talking about, like, a one-to-one correlation here?
Not at all. And this is a crucial distinction to make. Psychopathy, it's a spectrum. Some individuals might exhibit certain traits, but never act on them violently.
So it's more complex than that.
Oh, it's far more complex than that. It's a combination of factors.
Mm-hmm.
Biology, early childhood experiences, even, seemingly random events, they can influence how these predispositions manifest. Someone with psychopathic traits who grows up in a loving, supportive environment. They might become a ruthless CEO, but never harm a fly. It's rarely, if ever, just one thing.
So it's a nature and nurture cocktail. Shaken, not stirred, with the dash of random chance thrown in for good measure. That's what makes this so hard to predict, right? We can't just, round up everyone who had a rough childhood or shows a lack of empathy on a brain scan.
Exactly. And that's where things get, ethically tricky.
Yeah.
Because the more we understand about the biological underpinnings of violence,
Yeah.
the more we grapple with this question. If we can identify these markers early on, what do we do with that information?
It's like a scary version of Minority Report. Do we start labeling kids as potential criminals based on their brain chemistry? How do we even begin to balance the rights of the individual with the need to protect society? It's a tightrope walk, for sure.
And that's a discussion, frankly, that we need to have as a society.
Right.
Because the more we learn, the more we need to consider.
No.
Are there interventions, maybe even therapies, that could help redirect these individuals, especially if identified early on?
It's not about letting anyone off the hook. But if there's even a chance we can prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place, are we obligated to explore it? It certainly adds a whole new dimension to crime prevention, doesn't it? It's not just about catching the bad guys after the fact, but understanding the factors that create them, and potentially intervening before it's too late.
And that's the power of deep dives like this, right? We're not just exploring the dark side of humanity, we're illuminating it. And with understanding comes a potential for change.
So, to recap, we've journeyed into the chilling world of serial killers, exploring this unsettling combination of psychology, biology, and life experiences that contribute to their creation. We've learned about the cooling off period, the deep-seated psychological needs, the role of childhood trauma, the chilling reality of psychopathy, and even glimpsed the differences in their brains.
But perhaps the most important takeaway is the understanding that there's no single factor, no guaranteed formula that creates a serial killer. Each case is a tragic, complex story. And while we may never have all the answers, by continuing to ask questions, by continuing to explore this unsettling territory, we can strive to create a world where such darkness has fewer and fewer victims.
Absolutely. And it's more than just morbid curiosity. There's a real desire to understand what makes someone capable of such acts. It taps into this primal fear we all have, this fascination with the extremes of human behavior.
Right. So let's just get right to it. What creates a serial killer? Is it nature or nurture? Is there some serial killer gene they're born with?
You'd think it'd be that simple. Truth is, it's way more complicated. Imagine a recipe, right?
Yeah.
Ingredients can change a bit, but the end result is always a tragedy. It's a perfect storm of factors.
Not as straightforward as genes versus upbringing, then. More like a whole bunch of things going wrong.
Exactly. Some people, they might be predisposed to it, like a vulnerability to psychopathy. But even then, there's usually a trigger. Trauma, abuse, neglect something pushes them over the edge. So they're primed for it, and then life just throws gasoline on the fire.
Powerful way to put it. And it's not a guarantee, right? Not every person with these tendencies becomes a killer. And the reverse is true, too. Not every serial killer fits that psychopath mold perfectly.
That's actually kind of reassuring in a weird way. So if it's not all about being wired wrong from birth, what else contributes to someone going down this path?
Well, some have other personality disorders. Extreme narcissism, for example, where their needs are all that matter. Others might be driven by delusions, psychosis, living in a reality totally different from ours. It's like their minds fracture, and right and wrong get all messed up.
So we can't just slap a label on them and call it a day.
Yeah.
Way more nuanced. Got any real-life examples of how these different factors play out? I'm a story person, helps me understand.
Absolutely. Take Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Now, his crimes were heavily influenced by Satanism. He wasn't a textbook psychopath, but this twisted belief system fueled his actions. Believed he was doing the devil's work, essentially.
chilling stuff. And that brings up another point. Not all serial killers are driven by the same thing, right?
Nope, not at all. The why behind the murders is as individual as the killers. Anger, revenge, a lust for power even. Some warped sense of love.
Okay, so we've got this recipe for disaster brewing predisposition, triggers, twisted motivations. But that doesn't explain the jump from thought to action. Murder is, well, it's final. What pushes them over that line?
That's where the how comes in. Their methods, planning, execution. We call it organized versus disorganized, and it helps us get inside their heads a little.
Okay, now I'm interested. Lay it on me, what's the difference?
Think of it like this. The crime scene is their canvas. An organized killer. Their canvas is pristine. Meticulous planning, every detail thought out. They're playing chess, choosing their victims strategically, stalking them. They don't want to leave a trace. See, they want to be ghosts.
So it's almost like they take pride in being so careful, so good at disappearing.
Exactly. It's a performance, and they're the directors. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, he even documented his crimes, sent taunting letters to the police, needed that validation, that proof he was smarter.
God, that's terrifying. How do you even begin to catch someone like that?
It's tough, no doubt. But everyone makes mistakes, even the most careful killer. A fiber, a footprint, tiny things can unravel everything. But there's the flip side, the disorganized killer.
If organized is meticulous, I'm guessing disorganized is, well, not so much.
You got it. Their canvas, chaos, pure frenzy, acting on impulse, overwhelming rage, or need for instant gratification. Messy. Lots of evidence left behind.
So not a lot of thought for covering their tracks then. No need for that control.
Nope. They're focused on the act itself, the release, the fantasy. They act when the urge hits, grabbing whatever's handy.
Two sides of a horrifying coin, but totally different approaches. You said law enforcement uses this to profile these guys. How does that help catch them?
Profiling's tricky. Not foolproof, it's not mind reading, but using what we know to paint a psychological picture. Crime scene, victims, methods, it all gives us clues.
So if the scene screams organized, investigators can narrow their search based on that. Someone controlled, meticulous, maybe even a little full of themselves.
Right. And a chaotic, disorganized scene. Maybe someone impulsive, struggling with mental illness, living on the edge, but it's just a starting point. Can't rely on it entirely.
Of course, because even within those types, there's going to be tons of variation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every single case, every killer, unique. That's what makes it so fascinating. But let's dig deeper into the psychology, specifically the role of fantasy. And this is where it gets really interesting and disturbing.
Okay, I'm ready to go down that rabbit hole. But first, a quick reminder for our listeners. This is heavy stuff. Don't hesitate to take a break if you need to. Grab some water and come back when you're ready.
Good advice. Mental health is important, especially when we're exploring the dark side of humanity like this.
All right, we're back. We were about to get into the role fantasy plays in the minds of serial killers. And I gotta be honest, this is the part that always gets under my skin, that peek behind the curtain of their darkest thoughts.
It's a crucial part of understanding why they do what they do. For a lot of these killers, it's not a spur-of-the-moment thing, you know. It's the culmination of these elaborate fantasies they've been building, sometimes for years, in the back of their minds. And these fantasies, they're often incredibly disturbing, violent. They become an obsession, the driving force behind their actions.
So it's not just impulse. It's like they're acting out these deeply ingrained scenarios, making those fantasies a reality.
Exactly. It's like they're bridging the gap between their internal world and the outside world, you know. They're imposing those fantasies onto reality, and that gives them a sense of control, especially in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable.
Right, especially when you consider what we talked about earlier, some of them feeling powerless in their everyday lives. Killing, as horrific as it is, gives them that power back.
Exactly. And that need for control, it often shows up in the rituals and patterns of their crimes. How they choose their victims, the souvenirs they take, the way they pose the bodies. It's all about dominance, writing the story the way they want it.
Like they're creating these gruesome art pieces with each detail planned out for some twisted purpose.
A chilling way to put it, but yeah, you're on the right track. Think about the Zodiac Killer. His cryptic messages, the ciphers he sent to the press. That wasn't just to taunt the cops. It was about making a spectacle of his crimes, turning it into a game where he was in control and everyone else was just trying to keep up. Control and a twisted need to be recognized as intelligent, as cunning.
Bone chilling. So once they've gone through all that, the planning, the act, the aftermath, what then? Guilt. Satisfaction.
That's where the cycle of compulsion comes in. See, the act of killing, it often triggers a rush of brain chemicals, adrenaline, dopamine. It's a euphoric feeling, and for some, it can be very addictive. A temporary high, but it takes over everything.
So they're chasing that high just like an addict chases a drug.
In a way, yes. But just like any addiction, the more they chase it, the harder it gets to reach that same high. They need more, something more intense, more shocking to feel it again. And that's often when we see an escalation in their crimes, them sinking further into depravity.
A vicious cycle, then. The fantasy drives the act provides a temporary fix, but then the need comes back stronger, making them want to feel that again and again.
Exactly. And to make things even more complex, the act of killing, even for someone with serious mental illness, it can be psychologically damaging. Taking a human life can create a huge amount of internal conflict.
So how do they deal with that, the horror of what they've done versus the need to keep going?
Defense mechanisms. They rationalize, dehumanize their victims, see them as obstacles, or even willing participants in their fantasies. It allows them to compartmentalize, distance themselves from the emotional weight of their actions.
A way to protect themselves, to hold on to their sanity even as they're doing these unspeakable things. It's terrifying to think someone could be so detached from reality.
It really shows how complex and adaptable the human mind is, even at its darkest. But that doesn't excuse anything. We need to understand these things not to sympathize, but to get a clearer picture of what's going on. And hopefully, that understanding can help prevent these things from happening in the first place.
Right, because if we can understand what drives these individuals, what to look for, maybe we can step in before it's too late.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. And in this case, that knowledge could save lives.
Okay, so we've covered a lot: the nature of serial killers, the motivations, the methods, and the terrifying role of fantasy and compulsion. But there's a crucial aspect we haven't touched on yet: the victims.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the psychology of the killers themselves, see them as these enigmatic figures. We can't forget, behind every case, every statistic, there are real people whose lives were tragically cut short.
It's heart-wrenching thinking about the families shattered, the communities forever changed. Those victims are not just names on a file. They're sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, friends and colleagues, people with hopes and dreams.
You're right. Their stories, their humanity, deserve to be remembered. And while nothing can bring them back, we owe it to them to keep searching for answers, to work towards a future where these tragedies are less likely to happen. And that means tackling it from all angles, understanding the psychology, improving law enforcement, and building a more empathetic and supportive society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Preventing these tragedies isn't just about catching the bad guys after the fact. It's about creating a world where those dark impulses are less likely to take hold in the first place.
Well said. It's a complex issue, no easy answers. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for a better future, one where every single life is valued and protected.
I couldn't agree more. We've been at this for a while now, and I don't want to overload you with information. How about a quick breather, gather our thoughts, and then we come back to wrap up this deep dive into the chilling yet somehow fascinating world of serial killer psychology.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, we're back. And you know, this deep dive has really given me a lot to process. We've talked about what makes a serial killer tick, their motivations, their methods, the role fantasy plays. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about prevention. You said that knowing the warning signs could be key to stopping these tragedies before they even happen. So what should we be looking out for?
That's the big question, right? And we got to be careful here, not jumping to conclusions. We're talking about potential risk factors, not slapping labels on anyone, but some things that pop up in childhood, adolescence. A fascination with violence, for one, and I don't mean the kid who likes action movies, but a real deep, almost obsessive interest in violence and cruelty.
So more than just age-appropriate stuff, something darker.
Right. Another big one, and it's often brushed off, is cruelty to animals. People dismiss it as just a phase, but studies show a strong link between that and later violence towards people. It's like a testing ground for their aggression, a way to control something without real consequences.
That's disturbing, but it makes a horrible kind of sense. If you're okay hurting something that can't fight back, it's not that far a jump to a human victim. Anything else we should watch out for?
Isolation, trouble connecting with others, lack of empathy. These individuals, they often struggle to relate on an emotional level. They might seem cold, distant, unconcerned about how others feel.
So not just outward aggression, but these more internal emotional signs too.
Exactly. And this is important. These are just potential red flags, not guarantees. Not everyone showing these signs is going to hurt someone. But If we recognize them early, we create a chance to step in, offer support, guidance before it's too late.
And that's the message I want to emphasize: intervention, not judgment. If you see something, say something, reach out. Whether it's a friend, family, even yourself, there's help out there, people who understand.
Absolutely. Early intervention is key. It's about understanding that these people are often fighting their own demons, their own internal struggles. Support, therapy, guidance. We can help them find a different path.
That's a powerful thought, and one I think we need to hear, especially given how heavy this topic is. It'd be easy to get lost in the darkness, the horror of these crimes. But there's always hope. There's always a chance for change, for healing, for choosing a different way.
Couldn't agree more. The journey might be long, it might be hard, but together, with knowledge, with compassion, with a commitment to a better world, we can make a difference.
And that's a perfect note to end on.
Okay, so when we talk about serial killers, the one thing that always gets me is that need for control. It just seems like such a common thread.
Absolutely. You see it in so many cases. It's like this urge, this compulsion to just exert power, you know? And it's
Yeah.
not always like a physical thing either, you know? Take the BTK killer, for instance.
Oh yeah, good example.
He was all about control, but it was as much about the mental game as anything else. The letters, the taunting.
It's like he wanted to be the puppet master,
Uh-huh.
right? Pulling everyone's strings.
Exactly. He wanted to control the narrative, the investigation. It was all part of the thrill for him.
So it's more than just the act of killing then. It's everything surrounding it.
Yeah.
The planning, the selection of victims.
The aftermath, even. It's about creating this whole twisted fantasy world where they have all the power.
And for some, like BTK, it seemed like it was also about getting that recognition, you know, that sense of power over not just the victims, but over the whole community, the media.
Oh, absolutely. That need for recognition, for notoriety, it can be a huge motivating factor, like a drug almost.
Now, here's the thing that always gets me, and maybe this is going to sound weird, but some of them, they stop.
It is strange, isn't it? And it's not because they're caught or anything.
Right, like they just stop on their own. How does that even happen? Does the urge just disappear?
Well, it's a question that's baffled experts for years, but there are some theories. Sometimes it seems like it might be connected to external factors, you know, life changes.
Like what?
Like a new relationship, a new job, a move, something that disrupts their routine, their fantasies.
So it's not that the darkness goes away, really. It's more like,
More like it gets, I don't know, like put on hold or something.
yeah, like life throws them a curveball and they have to
Right.
focus on that for a while.
Exactly. We see that with Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. He had these periods where he, you know, seemingly just stopped killing for a while, and it often coincided with some kind of significant change in his life.
It's like they've got this killer instinct on a dimmer switch or something, you know.
That's an interesting way to put it, actually.
But it makes you wonder, like, is it really just external stuff? Or could something be going on internally, too?
Yeah.
Like psychologically? Could they just kind of burn out? Is that even possible?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it, that someone could just, like, switch off that part of themselves.
Right.
And while we can't, you know, rule it out completely, it's probably more complicated than that. There's some thought that for some killers, the act of killing, it takes a toll on them emotionally, you know?
Oh, like they're putting so much energy into it, just sort of drains them.
Exactly. It's draining. The planning, the stalking, the actual act, the cover-up, it all requires a massive amount of emotional and mental energy.
So it's like they need a break to recharge, almost.
In a sense, yeah. They might go dormant for a while just to, you know, sort of rebuild those reserves. And for a lot of these guys, it's not just about the killing itself, right?
Right.
It's about fulfilling these deep-seated fantasies, these psychological needs.
Right.
And if those needs change, evolve, even just temporarily,
Then the urge to kill could subside.
potentially, it's like the script flips in their head or something. Again, not excusing their actions, but it's another piece of the puzzle.
Right. So we've got the control thing, the burnout angle.
Yeah.
What about the gender aspect of all this?
Yeah.
It's almost always men, right?
It's a huge question, and I don't think there's one easy answer. Could be nature, could be nurture, could be, you know, a little of both. But one theory I find interesting looks at how we raise boys versus girls.
Oh, yeah.
Think about it. Boys, from a young age, they're often taught to suppress their emotions. Be tough, don't cry.
Man up. Right. I've heard that one a time or two.
Exactly. So they bottle up all those emotions, and over time, that can lead to, well, some unhealthy coping mechanisms, to say the least.
Instead of processing their emotions, they're just like stuffing them down.
Essentially. And for some, that can manifest in really destructive ways, violence being one of them.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But obviously not every guy who bottles up his emotions becomes a serial killer, right?
Of course not. But it might help explain, in part, why we see this huge gender gap.
Okay. So what about the women who do become serial killers? What's their deal? Because they're obviously not getting the whole suppress your emotions memo.
Right. And that's what's so interesting. With women, the motives often seem different. Less about, this raw need for power and control.
And more about,
achieving a specific goal. It's often more calculated, more instrumental.
okay, like what? Like they're trying to eliminate a threat or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, like self-preservation or revenge.
Exactly. Or even something like financial gain. Aileen Wuornos is a classic example. Remember her?
Vaguely.
She claimed her victims, all men, had tried to assault her while she was, working as a prostitute. So her crimes, at least in her mind, they were a way to protect herself.
Right.
To take control back.
Wow. That's...
Dark stuff. But it illustrates the point.
Yeah. And it's not just the motives that are different, right? Their methods tend to be different, too.
Often, yeah. Less about brute force, more about, well, let's just say they can be more creative.
Like poisonings and stuff?
Exactly. Or manipulation, things that don't require, physical strength.
It's like a whole different kind of scary.
It is. But it all comes back to that same basic need for control.
So we've got all these factors at play, right? The psychology, the societal influences, the gender roles. It's a lot.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
And the truth is, we've only just scratched the surface here. There's still so much we don't know about what makes a serial killer.
And maybe we never will.
Maybe. But that's part of what makes it all so fascinating. And terrifying, too, of course. Because it reminds us that the capacity for that kind of darkness, it's there in all of us.
Yeah. Makes you think.
Yeah.
Well, to our listener who requested this rather intense deep dive, we hope you got what you asked for. Lots to unpack here.
Indeed.
A dark subject, but hopefully we shed a little light on it, no pun intended.
I think we managed.
Which, by the way,
Right.
this deep dive isn't about just focusing on the gore.
Yeah.
It's more about trying to understand why this whole subject just grabs us.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we so fascinated by serial killers? What is it about these stories?
I think you've hit on something there that's really gets at the core of what makes us human, our psychology. It's complicated. Several things are happening.
Yeah.
One is that what they do is so far outside the bounds of what most of us would even consider
Right.
that it's almost like they take on this kind of mythical quality.
Totally. Yeah. Like Ted Bundy. I mean, come on. The guy was charming his victims, escaping from custody. He even acted as his own lawyer.
I know.
It's like, how is this even real life?
And that just plays right into the next thing, which is that we're hardwired to try and understand things, right?
Yeah.
Especially the dark parts, the things that frighten us. We want to know what's going on in their heads. Why did they do these things? And we feel like if we can just understand it, then maybe we can somehow get some control over it.
Oh. Okay, that makes sense. Like, okay, I get it. It's like when you watch a scary movie and you know it's not real, you keep telling yourself, it's just a movie, it's just a movie.
Yeah.
It's like a way of facing that fear without totally freaking out.
It is. It's like a way of confronting that darkness, but in a way that feels contained and safe. But it goes even deeper than that. I mean, think about it. There's this inherent psychological tension that's kind of back and forth between us, the audience,
Oh, interesting.
and the serial killer.
Oh, okay.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
It's like we're trying to get inside their heads.
Yeah.
Unpack it all, figure out how they work.
Totally.
Maybe even a little bit of like, could we have outsmarted them?
Yeah.
And you know what? Media plays a huge role in how we see all of this. I mean, think about Hannibal Lecter.
Oh, right.
He's brilliant, a psychiatrist, but then he's also a cannibal and a serial killer.
Right.
It's terrifying, but you're just drawn to him.
Yeah. And that's where it gets really tricky, how media portrays serial killers, because it can be dangerous.
Yeah.
Like, look at Dexter.
Okay.
He's a blood spatter analyst, so he's working on these cases,
Right.
but he's also a serial killer himself.
Right.
But he only kills other killers.
Okay.
So you start to get into this gray area
Yeah, so.
where you're almost rooting for the guy,
Right.
even though he's taking lives.
And it's easier to get caught up in it all when it's fiction. It's like
You know?
these characters aren't real, so it's fun to think about.
Yeah.
But we forget that there are real victims out there. Their
Yeah.
families, their loved ones, dealing with the very real fallout of these crimes.
Absolutely. It's not a game or a movie for them.
Right.
This is their reality.
It really makes you think, like, if this is happening in the real world, is there any way to know? To predict it? Could we see it coming?
I mean, that is the question, isn't it?
Right.
The million-dollar question. And the truth is, even with all that we know now about how these minds work, the psychology of it all, predicting something like this with absolute certainty, it's still really difficult.
So are there, like, any surefire giveaways? Is there a sign? Anything we can point to?
I wish I had a better answer for you, but no, not really.
Okay.
You see, there are certain things researchers have found, certain factors that might make someone more likely to go down that path.
Right.
Like if they had a rough childhood, experienced trauma, or if they were cruel to animals when they were younger,
right,
or if they have certain personality disorders. But here's the thing, and this is what makes it so tricky. None of those things automatically mean someone will become a serial killer.
So you could have someone with all those things in their past who never hurts anyone.
Right.
And then someone else with, like, no red flags, no warning signs.
Exactly. It's like that case with Edmund Kemper, remember?
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant guy, seemed totally normal, even met with psychologists before he started killing people. It just goes to show how complicated this all is.
That is both completely fascinating and really unsettling.
I know, it's hard to wrap your head around.
So if we can't predict it, what can we do? I mean, how do we even begin to prevent these horrible things from happening?
I think that's where we need to shift our thinking a little,
Okay.
Instead of trying to predict who's going to do this, maybe we need to focus on creating environments where it's less likely to happen in the first place.
So more about prevention than playing detective.
Exactly. What if every time a kid was cruel to an animal or showed violent tendencies, we stepped in, got them help? We might be able to change their path, stop things from escalating.
I have to say, this whole deep dive has really been eye-opening.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's terrifying. But it feels important to try and understand why these things happen.
I agree. And hopefully by understanding it, really getting into the motivations, the warning signs, all of it, we can be more aware, more empathetic, and maybe even prevent it from happening in the future.
A lot to think about, for sure.
Yeah.
Curiosity is definitely part of it. It's that urge we all have to look at stuff that scares us, even though, we know we probably shouldn't.
Yeah.
Some evolutionary biologists actually think it might be something left over from way back, from our ancestors, like a way of learning about possible danger, but in a safe way so they didn't end up, someone's dinner.
Right. That makes sense. Like, I totally get that. I mean, it's like when you slow down to look at a car accident, even though it's probably awful. But serial killers, it feels different, It's not just a quick glance. We want to really understand them, like get inside their heads, figure out their motives, why they did it.
You've hit on a really important point there, the why. Humans really crave order and understanding, right? And serial killers, well, they just completely upend our sense of how the world is supposed to work. Their actions totally go against all the norms, all the expectations we have that make us feel safe.
So we try to understand their logic, even though it's really messed up, to reassure ourselves that it won't happen to us. Like, if we can just figure out the warning signs and connect the dots.
Exactly. It gives us this sense of control, you see. It really plays into our survival instincts. If we can understand what makes a serial killer tick, well, maybe we can spot those warning signs and protect ourselves, protect our loved ones.
And that need to feel in control, like you were saying, it makes you think about the whole true crime thing, right? Like, it's everywhere now. Podcasts, documentaries, even the shows we watch. We just can't get enough. It's like we all think we're detectives now.
Oh, absolutely. True crime, it often lays out these really complex cases, kind of like puzzles, right? Each piece of evidence, each interview, it's like getting closer to the big picture.
Yeah.
And I think that really speaks to something we all crave knowledge. Figuring things out.
And we can't forget just like the social aspect of it too. I know when I listen to a good true crime podcast, I'm like immediately texting someone, got to compare theories, argue about the details. It's part of the fun.
You're so right. True crime has become a totally social thing. People bond over it, right? Debating theories online, going to conventions about specific cases. It's not just like passively watching anymore. People are engaging with this stuff with each other. It's a whole thing.
Yeah, it's like a giant, slightly morbid book club, huh? But, when you really think about it, it's more than just the excitement of the case itself. It feels like when we dig into these stories, especially about serial killers, it's like we're facing some really well, really uncomfortable truths about what it means to be human.
That's a really perceptive point. When we explore these really extreme examples of darkness, we're kind of like holding up a mirror, aren't we?
Hmm.
It makes you ask yourself, what separates us from them? Could anyone be capable of these horrible things given the right, well, or I guess the wrong circumstances?
Okay, now that is a little creepy, but I see what you mean. It's like staring into the abyss, hoping it doesn't stare back, right? But maybe, in a way, it helps us figure out our own moral lines, where we draw the line.
Exactly. And when we do that, when we really define those boundaries for ourselves, we're reaffirming our values, our sense of empathy, compassion, all of it. It's like a reminder of how important the rules are, the social contracts we have that keep us from, well, from going down that dark path.
So it's like, by trying to understand the worst of humanity, the really awful stuff, it makes us appreciate the things that actually make us human even more. Things like, well, like love, empathy, connecting with others, all of that.
You got it. And I really think deep down, that's a big part of why we're so drawn to serial killers, why we're still talking about this. It's not just about the gruesome details or the shock value. It's about trying to wrap our heads around human nature itself, the good and well, the very, very bad.
It's kind of funny when you think about it. We spend so much time trying to get inside the heads of these killers, right?
Yeah.
Trying to figure out, like, what went wrong, what made them the way they are. But maybe, just maybe, we're, I don't know, searching for something else entirely. Not that we're okay with what they did or anything, but it's more like we're trying to understand. I don't know if this makes sense, but like the whole spectrum of what it means to be human, the good, the bad, even the stuff we don't even want to think about.
I think that's a really profound way to look at it. Our thing with serial killers, it's not like just about them. It's about us too. It's about, I don't know, pushing the boundaries of our own empathy, seeing how far our understanding can go. You know what I mean? It's about that uncomfortable feeling we get when we realize that we all have the potential for those things, the good and the really, truly awful.
It's almost like that Nietzsche quote, if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes what we see in that abyss, well, it's not always pretty, but it can also make us appreciate even more, the things that really matter, our values, our relationships, the stuff that makes life worth living.
So yeah, next time you're like totally glued to some true crime documentary or you're hooked on a podcast about, some crazy case, just remember, it's not just morbid curiosity, right? It's more than that. You're exploring what it means to be human. And maybe, just maybe, by staring into all that darkness, you're really learning to see the light even more.
Well said. It's been great, getting into all this with you today.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for coming on the deep dive with us, everyone. Until next time, keep asking the tough questions and never stop, exploring this wild world and everything in it.